Tax fraud. Making money from stolen tax records presents a slightly different set of obstacles than does profiting off stolen payment card numbers. Gonzalez and his co-conspirators had only one clear path to disposing of the TJX payment card data: manufacturing fraudulent cards and selling them, and they were racing to do that before the payment networks detected the fraud and preemptively canceled the cards. By contrast, the perpetrator of the SCDOR breach was under no time pressure and had several different possible paths to financial gain, ranging from filing fraudulent tax returns, to opening new accounts and loans in the victims' names, to initiating direct transfers from the victims' bank accounts using their routing information. Tax records are not the only type of data that offer criminals this range of profitable activities. For instance, health records, which often contain similar information, Social Security numbers, addresses, billing information, can provide comparable opportunities for financial fraud, with the added possibility of health insurance fraud. Given the flexibility and long-term value of tax returns, medical records, and other types of personal information that are less easily canceled and less well monitored than payment card numbers, it is no surprise that more criminals began to shift their focus to these alternatives to credit card records in the years following the SCDOR breach. In 2015, for instance, the IRS suffered a major breach, as did health insurance companies Anthem and Excellus Blue Cross Blue Shield. Moreover, analysis of online black market forums the previous year indicated that stolen medical records were selling for roughly 10 times as much as stolen payment card numbers, suggesting that there were more lucrative opportunities for criminals to use the former type of data. The advantages of stealing more permanent personal information, such as that found in medical and tax records, went beyond just enabling criminals to explore new forms of financial fraud and evade the threat of payment card expiration or cancellation. Financially motivated cybercriminals who dealt in tax and medical records were largely able to distance themselves from the ongoing fights among the major banks, retailers, and payment networks trying to shift breach costs and liability onto each other with microchip-enabled cards. This meant they could evade the formidable fraud detection teams built up by the payment networks in the wake of major payment card breaches. Those teams were often responsible for identifying major data breaches, including the TJX breach, by finding patterns in how and where compromised cards were used and tracing them back to a common source. This sort of pattern detection requires large, centralized organizations like MasterCard and Visa that have data on hundreds of millions of payment cards and can therefore piece together where they had all been stolen. Being able to determine how large-scale fraud was initiated, and specifically who was responsible for protecting the data that was used to perpetrate it, was crucial for being able to play out any of the fights over who was at fault and who would bear the costs of that fraud. It was much more difficult to try to determine what fraud, if any, had been perpetrated using the data stolen from the SCDOR, however. There is no equivalent of the payment card networks to track patterns across reports of tax fraud or identity theft and link them back to particular breaches. The years following the SCDOR breach did see a steep rise in tax fraud, with criminals filing returns in other people's names to claim their refunds. In 2015, the IRS even went so far as to issue nearly 3 million unique 6-digit identity protection PINs to individuals who had been the victims of identity theft, to ensure that no one else could file their returns without the corresponding PINs. But several individuals reported that their PINs had already been compromised when they tried to file their taxes, forcing them to file in person at IRS offices. This may have been because the online tool provided for users to retrieve any lost PINs asked them for information such as their past addresses, birth dates, and Social Security numbers, data that could easily have been retrieved from the breaches that originally made them susceptible to identity theft. It's certainly possible that the data stolen from the SCDOR was used to conduct some identity theft and file some fraudulent tax claims. Some analysts speculated as much when South Carolina saw a sharp increase in state tax fraud in 2015. But no one was in a position to determine conclusively how much of the fraud was tied to any particular breach. Without the ability to link fraud to specific data breaches, it becomes nearly impossible to sort out issues of liability. When several people whose tax returns were stolen from the SCDOR tried to file a class action suit against the SCDOR and its security contractor, TrustWave, a district court in Illinois dismissed the suit on the grounds that the plaintiffs could not show clear evidence of having suffered harm due to the breach, and therefore did not have standing to sue. Amber Straughtons, the primary plaintiff, alleged no fewer than 7 different types of injury she and the other members of the class action suit had suffered as a result of the breach of their personal identifying information, PII. 1. Untimely and/or inadequate notification of the data breach. 2. Improper disclosure of PII. 3. Loss of privacy. 4. Out-of-pocket expenses incurred to mitigate the increased risk of identity theft and/or identity fraud pressed upon them by the data breach. 5. The value of time spent mitigating identity theft and/or identity fraud and/or the increased risk of identity theft and/or identity fraud. 6. Deprivation of the value of PII. And 7. Violations of rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The plaintiffs' strategy was apparently to list every possible injury they could think of, from how rapidly they'd been notified of the breach, to the money they spent mitigating the consequences, to the more ephemeral loss of privacy and value of their personal information that they had suffered. But none of these injuries was sufficiently concrete to satisfy the court that the plaintiffs even deserved the opportunity to sue TrustWave, much less that the company owed them anything for its role in the breach. In dismissing the claim on the grounds that the plaintiffs lacked standing to sue, District Judge John J. Tharp, Jr. wrote, "These claims of injury are too speculative to permit the complaint to go forward. Whether Straughtons or other class members actually become victims of identity theft as a result of the data breach depends on a number of variables, such as whether their data was actually taken during the breach, whether it was subsequently sold or otherwise transferred, whether anyone who obtained the data attempted to use it and whether or not they succeeded. The harm that Straughtons fears is contingent on a chain of attenuated hypothetical events and actions by third parties, independent of the defendant." Tharp's decision, which echoes the logic of a 2013 dismissal of a similar suit brought against Barnes & Noble in the wake of a data breach, indicates just how difficult it is to assign financial liability in the aftermath of a data breach, unless the victims can provide clear evidence of specifically how the stolen data was used. Just the loss of privacy and increased risk of identity theft are not sufficient injuries to grant breach victims standing to sue the organizations responsible for protecting their data. But proving a direct link between a breach and specific instances of fraud is no easy task. Criminals can wait for years following a theft before they begin to use stolen information, like Social Security numbers or addresses. And given how many breaches of these types of information have occurred, and the lack of powerful, centralized monitoring intermediary organizations, it is not always possible to link an individual case of fraud to a specific breach. This inability to demonstrate the kind of concrete harm required to gain standing to sue is a recurring problem for those concerned about the security and privacy of their data, even beyond the context of data breaches. For instance, in a 2013 decision of the case Clapper v. Amnesty International, the Supreme Court ruled that the plaintiffs did not have standing to sue over surveillance efforts conducted under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendments Act of 2008 that might have been allowed for interception of their communications by the U.S. government. The Supreme Court took issue with the fact that the plaintiffs were merely speculating that their communications might be intercepted without knowing for certain whether or not such surveillance was being conducted, as indeed they would have no way of knowing, not being themselves members of the U.S. intelligence community. The Supreme Court majority ruling dismissed this argument as being based on a speculative chain of possibilities that does not establish that their potential injury is certainly impending, much as Tharp dismissed the South Carolinians' fears for being based on a chain of attenuated hypothetical events and actions. In another attempt to claim standing, the plaintiffs in the surveillance case argued that they had been harmed by having to take preemptive security precautions to protect their communications for fear of government interception, much like the plaintiffs in the TrustWave case had argued they had to spend time and money mitigating the increased risk of identity theft they now faced. The Supreme Court, like Tharp, was also unimpressed with this line of reasoning, ruling that the plaintiffs cannot manufacture standing by choosing to make expenditures based on hypothetical future harm. This notion that the risks posed by the loss of data security or privacy are no more than hypothetical future harms, and therefore insufficient to grant legal standing to sue, has important consequences for the victims of data breaches perpetrated for the purposes of identity theft. It leaves them with fewer options to pursue in the aftermath of such breaches, disdains the impacts those breaches have on their lives, and, most of all, gives organizations like TrustWave and SCDOR little incentive to do a better job protecting their data. Theft of tax records and tax fraud, like theft of medical records and insurance fraud, emerged largely in the wake of years of large-scale payment card breaches, like the one targeting TJX, as credit card companies got better at detecting fraud and initiating preemptive card cancellations and withdrawal limits. Like the TJX breach, the SCDOR breach involved several stages, from the initial phishing email through the exfiltration of the stolen data to external servers, and there were potential defensive interventions that might have been effective at each stage of the intrusion. Blame for the breach was quickly confined to one or two of these missing interventions, namely encryption and two-factor authentication, by media reports and state lawmakers, while Haley faulted the IRS data protection standards for the absence of these defenses, and the IRS in turn invoked the NIST security standards, which did include encryption. This circular deflection of responsibility to different government and industry guidelines highlights the challenges of trying to assemble a comprehensive set of security standards. Those challenges create a fertile environment for the targets of security breaches to shift blame onto the organizations that they feel have failed to tell them how to protect themselves. The SCDOR breach demonstrated how easily and quickly a breach could come to be blamed on a few specific technical controls, and, simultaneously, how incredibly difficult it is to assign financial liability to any of the involved parties in the absence of robust, specific standards or concrete, immediate harm. 4. The most wanted cybercriminal in the world. Game Over Zeus, CryptoLocker, and the rise of ransomware. When it comes to using computers to steal money, not even Albert Gonzalez, with his buried barrel of cash, has come close to matching the success of Russian hacker Yevgeny Bogachev. The $3 million bounty the FBI has offered for Bogachev's capture is larger than any that has ever been offered for a cybercriminal, but that sum represents only a tiny fraction of the money he has stolen through his botnet Game Over Zeus. At its height in 2012 and 2013, Game Over Zeus, or GAUZ, comprised between 500,000 and 1 million compromised computers all over the world that Bogachev could control remotely. For years, Bogachev used these machines to spread malware that allowed him to steal banking credentials and perpetrate online extortion. No one knows exactly how much money Bogachev stole from his thousands of victims using GAUZ, but the FBI conservatively estimates that it was well over $100 million. Meanwhile, Bogachev has spent lavishly on a fleet of luxury cars, 2 French villas, and, showing a kinship of sorts with Gonzalez, a large yacht. Bogachev lives in the resort town of Anapa on the Black Sea, where Russian officials have declined for years to arrest him or extradite him to the U.S. In fact, the Russian government has benefited from his criminal activity. While Bogachev has leveraged his vast network of compromised computers and credentials for financial gain, officials of the Russian government have also on occasion made use of his network and computer intrusions for espionage purposes of their own. But while the FBI cannot arrest Bogachev so long as he remains safely in Russia, in the summer of 2014, they partnered with several companies and researchers to try to shut down GAUZ and cut Bogachev off from the hundreds of thousands of compromised computers under his control. Dubbed Operation Tovar, the GAUZ takedown effort was an unprecedented law enforcement effort to fight cybercrime in terms of its scope, technical sophistication, and complexity. It included participants from Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and New Zealand, as well as the United States, and hinted at the potential for international cooperation and public-private partnerships to strengthen cybersecurity and attack criminal infrastructure. But the success of Operation Tovar was short-lived. Bogachev was still at large, and he quickly began to rebuild GAUZ. Meanwhile, similar strains of ransomware to those distributed by GAUZ soon began appearing, distributed by other closely related bots. In designing GAUZ, Bogachev pioneered a business model combining many technical intermediaries in the bot's infrastructure that made takedowns extremely difficult, with the removal of many of the financial intermediaries present in earlier financially motivated cybercrimes that had made policing efforts possible. This model proved to be uniquely lucrative and stubbornly resistant to even the savviest and most aggressive efforts of law enforcement. The success of GAUZ heralded a new wave of financial cybercrime focused on extortion rather than credit card fraud or identity theft, a trend that freed criminals from many of the constraints and law enforcement monitoring capabilities attached to traditional currencies and financial institutions. This shift to extracting payments directly from individual victims marked a dramatic change, not just in how financially motivated cybercrimes were carried out, but also in who bore the costs of these incidents. The rise of ransomware significantly altered the economics of cybercrime for criminals and victims alike, eliminating the roles of centralized middlemen and fences like Yastremski, who had served as the crux of many law enforcement investigations, and broadening dramatically the types of data it was possible for criminals to monetize. Game over Zeus. Criminals who infect users' computers and harness those machines to create botnets typically control those bots through a centralized command and control server that sends messages to the infected machines telling them what to do. For instance, when to send packets to a particular destination as part of a denial-of-service attack, or what emails to send. Since identifying all of the infected machines in a large bot and getting their owners to remove the bot's malware is a slow and largely ineffective process, takedown efforts often center on shutting down these command and control servers or cutting off their communications channels with the infected computers they are issuing orders to. The genius of the gauze design lay primarily in its ability to hide and even change this command and control component of the bot, so that law enforcement struggled to identify a centralized control server, and the gauze operators could quickly and easily shift to a new server in the event that their current one was discovered and cut off. To make it harder for anyone to figure out which servers were controlling the bot, gauze-infected devices did not all communicate with a single centralized command and control server. Instead, the bot operated on a peer-to-peer architecture, so each new infected device maintained connections to other infected machines, some of which served as intermediate proxy nodes, relaying commands from gauze operators and sending encrypted data back to their master drop servers. These proxy nodes made it considerably more difficult, though not impossible, to trace the bot back to a single controlling server, since the gauze operators were not communicating directly with most of the infected machines they controlled. The peer-to-peer architecture was not the only precaution Bogachev had taken in designing his bot. Just in case law enforcement officials were eventually able to trace the servers he was using to control gauze, he also programmed the gauze malware to automatically contact a series of 1,000 other Internet addresses every week and ask for instructions from any machines at those addresses in case he ever needed to set up a new command and control server. The gauze malware included a domain generation algorithm, or DGA, that generated that list of 1,000 new domain names every week, each belonging to one of 6 top-level domains, .com, .net, .org, .biz, .info, or .ru. Every week, each machine infected with gauze would go through that week's list and try to contact each of the 1,000 domains. So if Bogachev's servers were ever threatened, and he needed to set up a new command and control server, he could use any one of those domains during the appropriate week to reestablish communication with all of the infected machines and regain control of the bot. This meant that any takedown efforts directed at his command and control servers, typically the most vulnerable element of a bot, would be largely useless, since Bogachev would have 1,000 opportunities to set up a new such server every week, and there was no way to predict which domains the DGA would come up with for any given week. Just as Bogachev protected his command and control servers by hiding them behind layers of infected proxy machines, so too he shielded his bank accounts by routing stolen funds through other people. The E.L.V.I.S malware was designed not just to harness the machines it infected to Bogachev's bot, but also to steal banking and payroll credentials from those machines, primarily by logging all of the users' keystrokes, so that everything they typed, including passwords, would be captured and sent back to the bot's operators. Using those stolen credentials, Bogachev could then initiate fraudulent wire transfers from his victims, or redirect their paychecks to be directly deposited into accounts of his choosing. Hospital payroll systems, with their large numbers of employees and budgets, were a common E.L.V.I.S target. The FBI estimates that Bogachev stole hundreds of thousands of dollars in this manner from hospitals alone. E.L.V.I.S could even access bank accounts protected with two-factor authentication that required users to enter not just a password, but also another one-time code delivered by text message or physical token. This was the same technology that South Carolina was faulted for not purchasing prior to its breach. Using a man-in-the-middle attack to intercept messages between the victim and their banking site, E.L.V.I.S would present its victims with a fake login window that looked identical to their bank's real login web pages. Man-in-the-middle attacks occur when attackers insert themselves between two or more communicating parties in order to intercept or alter the communications unbeknownst to the people sending and receiving them. In this case, the E.L.V.I.S operators inserted themselves between users and their bank servers to intercept bank login information that the users believed they were sending directly to their bank. People trying to log in with two-factor authentication would receive their second authentication code over their phones or by token, and then enter it directly into the fake login field. The E.L.V.I.S malware would capture that authentication code and immediately send it back to the servers controlled by the E.L.V.I.S operators using the instant messaging service Jabber, and the E.L.V.I.S operators could then combine it with stolen passwords to access the targeted accounts protected by two-factor authentication. Bogachev didn't need to repatriate his profits as elaborately as Gonzalez did, with a small army of in-person cashers to deliver cash to Miami. But sending direct deposit payments or fraudulent transfers straight to his own accounts would still have been risky for Bogachev. Even if law enforcement officers in the U.S. were unable to arrest him, they would likely have been able to trace his accounts, block or at least flag transfers to them, and restrict any money being paid to them from the United States. So instead, Bogachev mirrored the proxy structure of his bot by building a small army of money mules, whose accounts he could route money through before the stolen funds ultimately reached his organization. The mules were recruited via spam email campaigns sent out by the E.L.V.I.S bot itself. If you are taking a career break, are on a maternity leave, recently retired, or simply looking for some part-time job, this position is for you, the emails said. These mules, based in the U.S., so that their accounts and transactions would not attract suspicion, received wire transfers and salary payments directly from the victims, kept a sum as their payment. Starting salary is $2,000 per month, plus commission, paid every month, and sent the rest along to another account, presumably belonging to the E.L.V.I.S operators. This network of money mules ensconced safely in their own homes, sitting at their computers, was already significantly less risky for Bogachev than Gonzalez's system of people walking around with large sums of cash and quantities of payment cards. But this setup did not satisfy Bogachev for long. For one thing, it required collecting specifically financial information and credentials from victims, and for another, It relied on a vast network of potentially vulnerable or disloyal money mules. So Bogachev's organization tested a ransom scheme, designing another piece of malware called CryptoLocker, which it spread to hundreds of thousands of computers using the gauze bot infrastructure. CryptoLocker, which first appeared in 2013, was also designed to steal money, but in a different manner than the gauze credential theft malware. Instead of capturing financial account credentials, CryptoLocker would encrypt the hard drives of computers it infected, and then demand that the victims make ransom payments if they ever wanted to be able to access their files again. The CryptoLocker ransomware demanded payments of hundreds of dollars, sometimes as high as $750, and gave its victims a window of 72 hours to pay, using either anonymous prepaid cash vouchers or the difficult-to-trace cryptocurrency Bitcoin before the victims would receive a decryption key for their devices. Many victims struggled to figure out how to make Bitcoin payments, so Bogachev and his conspirators helpfully set up a customer service website with step-by-step instructions. Unlike redirecting a payroll account, which requires providing potentially traceable information about the new destination account payments should be sent to, the nature of these ransom payments meant they could not be easily tied to specific financial accounts that U.S. law enforcement could control or monitor, alleviating the need for money mules and the risk of Bogachev having his accounts identified and frozen. As with all elements of gauze-directed financial crime, there is no conclusive evidence of how much money CryptoLocker managed to extort from its victims, but one analysis of Bitcoin logs indicated that during just one 2-month period in 2013, from October 15 to December 18, the ransomware program raked in roughly $27 million. Operation Tovar. What made Gauze and Bogachev especially difficult to trace and shut down lay largely in the bot's multi-layered, constantly changing infrastructural setup. The criminal scheme combined intermediate proxy hosts used to control the bot, the DGA's weekly list of new domains that enabled them to easily shift their command and control servers, and the financial middlemen and anonymous cryptocurrencies they relied on for financial transfers. The law enforcement shutdown of the bot's operations required tremendous investment in Operation Tovar, as well as extensive international cooperation, sophisticated technical expertise, and also some old-fashioned sleuthing efforts. But the rapid reemergence of the bot and its signature malware in the months following the takedown spoke to the resilience of ransomware and distributed bot models in simultaneously inserting many layers of infrastructural intermediaries, proxies, that made technical remediation difficult, while also excluding almost all of the traditional financial intermediaries, fences, and money mules that had made policing efforts and legal remediations possible. Operation Tovar began when UK law enforcement authorities provided the FBI with information about a suspicious server in the UK. The server hosted a password-protected website called visitcoastweekend.com with a frequently asked questions page that read, in Russian, "Starting on September, we are beginning to work through the panel where you now find yourselves. Fraudulent, money transfers, and drop, money mule, managers are synchronizing their work through our panel, which enables a much greater optimization of the work process and increase in the productivity of our work. Starting from this moment, all drop, money mule, managers with whom we are working, and all fraudulent, money transferers who work with us, are working through this panel. We wish you all successful and productive work." The site also included a detailed list of hundreds of financial transactions with dates, company names, amounts, and the type of transfer. The FBI undertook the painstaking work of verifying that these transfers were indeed tied to the gauze virus. Agents interviewed representatives from a composite materials company in the Western District of Pennsylvania to confirm that a $198,234.03 wire transfer on October 21, 2011, from a SunTrust bank account, the details of which were listed in the VisitCoastWeekend.com ledger, was in fact the result of credentials stolen from a gauze-infected machine. For all listed companies with respect to which the FBI manually reviewed information in the ledger and compared it to information from either field interviews or bank fraud reporting, the information was an exact match, FBI Special Agent Elliot Peterson wrote in a court declaration. Meanwhile, the FBI found and interviewed several of the money mules recruited by the gauze operators. Heidi Nelson described how, after losing her job in 2009 and posting her resume online, she was contacted by someone claiming to work for a Russian company who subsequently hired Nelson to receive payments and wire them to Russia. Renee Michelli told the FBI a similar story about being hired by a supposed Russian software company, 1C, to receive payments within the United States and then transfer them to Russian accounts. The evidence provided by the Money Mules and the VisitCoastWeekend.com server helped the FBI begin to map out the extensive technical and human infrastructure responsible for spreading gauze and CryptoLocker, but offered few hints as to who was in charge of the operation. To trace the ringleaders, the FBI turned to analysis done by security firm E.L.V.I.S about the ability of gauze to evade two-factor authentication using the Jabber messaging protocol. E.L.V.I.S found that many of the credentials stolen by gauze were transmitted via Jabber to the domain incomeet.com, which was hosted at the IP address 66.199.248.195. That particular IP address was associated with a server operated by a company called Easy.net, headquartered in Brooklyn, New York. The FBI interviewed an Easy.net employee who told them that the server in question had been leased to a customer named Alexei S., who said he was associated with a company called IP Server Limited, located in Moscow. The FBI obtained search warrants for the contents of the incomeet.com server in Brooklyn and found extensive chat logs in which different users, under pseudonyms such as Tank and Aqua, exchanged links to news articles about their successful thefts from banks. "This is what they damn wrote about me," Tank messaged Lucky12345 in July 2009, referencing a Washington Post article about money stolen from the Bullitt County Fiscal Court in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. Discussing the same article, Aqua wrote to Tank, "They described the entire scheme. The bastards. I'm really pissed. They exposed the entire deal." The FBI had found the people responsible for gauze, but the only thing they knew about them was their pseudonyms. Agents began combing through the online forums where criminals discuss and disseminate malware programs. A search warrant related to another investigation allowed them to seize and search the contents of one such forum, mazafaka.info, where they found someone sending messages under the username Lastic, who took credit for writing the gauze malware. "I'm Monster, and not his reincarnation. I'm the author of Zeus," Lastic wrote in a private message to another user, sent through mazafaka.info on June 5, 2010. In messages to several users on mazafaka.info, Lastic indicated that he could be contacted at the addresses lucky12345@jabber.cz and bashorg@talking.cc, suggesting that he was also the Lucky12345 whose chat transcripts had been found on the incomeet.com server. Furthermore, when registering for his Mazafaka account, Lastic/Lucky12345 had provided the email address alexgarbachuk@yahoo.com as his contact address. With a search warrant, officers were able to retrieve all of the records related to that email address from a service provider. The service provider gave the FBI all of the information that customer had used to set up his account, including a home address in Krasnodar Krai, Russia, and his name, Yevgeny Bogachev. Cross-referencing the IP addresses used to access Bogachev's email account with those used to access visitcoastweekend.com and a CryptoLocker command and control server, traced from the U.S. to the U.K. to Luxembourg, the investigators found that there was significant overlap and deduced that Bogachev was involved in both schemes. Moreover, he had high-level administrative access to the gauze server, leading the FBI to believe he was a leader of the gauze conspiracy. The identification of Bogachev was no small feat, as highlighted by the fact that the FBI was able to identify several of his co-conspirators only by their online aliases: Temp Special, Dead, Chingiz 911, and Mr. Kiki Piki. If Bogachev had been more careful about not using his real name when registering for accounts, or masking his IP address when he accessed the gauze and CryptoLocker servers, he might not now be the FBI's most wanted cybercriminal, though it's also possible he felt confident that the Russian authorities wouldn't turn him over, and therefore didn't go out of his way to hide his identity. The work of tracking down Bogachev and the servers running gauze and CryptoLocker was largely low-tech, interviewing money mules and victims, cross-referencing lengthy data logs, combing through websites and Russian hacker forums. By contrast, the actual takedown efforts to remove the hundreds of thousands of infected machines from Bogachev's control involved extensive technical expertise, much of which is redacted from the public records of the incident, to cut off the communications between all of Gauze's complicated layers of peer and proxy nodes, while also seizing the servers issuing commands to them, including machines in Canada, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Law enforcement also had to make sure that Bogachev and his associates would be unable to re-establish control over the infected machines through a new server using the domain names generated each week by the DGA. The FBI worked with a number of security researchers to reverse engineer the DGA and figure out how it generated the list of domain names it provided to the infected computers every week. That way, the FBI would know which 1,000 domains were being selected every week in advance. Then, right before the takedown, they acquired a temporary restraining order that required domain registries in the U.S. to redirect any attempts to contact those 1,000 domains to a substitute government-run server. Since the domains generated by the DGE with the .ru top-level domain were not controlled by registries in the U.S., but rather by companies in Russia, the order also required U.S. service providers to block any connection requests to the .ru domains generated by the DGA. The culmination of all these efforts, the DGA reverse engineering and preemptive restrictions on the domains it generated, the seizure of CryptoLocker command and control servers all over the world, and the court orders authorizing redirection of the connection attempts by any gauze-infected machines came in June 2014, and the coordinated takedown delivered a significant blow to the bot's operations. Operation Tovar was touted by the FBI as a massive and multi-layered strike against every element of the infrastructure underlying gauze and CryptoLocker, a triumph of international cybercrime fighting and public sector/private industry collaboration, a victory of law enforcement sleuthing and technical ingenuity over the increasingly sophisticated online criminal world. In a statement posted by the FBI on their website on June 2, 2014, FBI Executive Assistant Director Robert Anderson called Gauze the most sophisticated botnet the FBI and our allies have ever attempted to disrupt. And U.S. Deputy Attorney General James Cole praised the operation's combination of traditional law enforcement techniques and cutting-edge technical measures necessary to combat highly sophisticated cyber schemes targeting our citizens and businesses. 1 month later, on July 11, 2014, the Justice Department reported that the number of computers infected with gauze malware had been reduced by 31%, thanks to law enforcement intervention. To some extent, all of the FBI's claims were true. Operation Tovar was a triumph of defense over offense. It was an example of U.S. law enforcement partnering effectively with industry and international officials, and it was a very technically sophisticated endeavor. But it also relied largely on the carelessness of gauze operators and their money mules, rather than technical vulnerabilities inherent to the operation Bogachev had established. So even though the FBI had dealt a significant, if temporary, setback to gauze, Bogachev's criminal model was still solid, and it would only be a matter of time before he, as well as numerous other copycats, would find ways to tweak it, infect more machines, and get back to business. The rise of ransomware. The most enduring legacy of Bogachev's operation was not the decentralized peer-to-peer bot model, which deliberately introduced several layers of intermediaries between the gauze-infected computers and their command and control servers in order to confound takedown attempts, but the economic model of extortion via CryptoLocker, which just as deliberately removed many layers of money mules and intermediaries from financial transactions. These financial intermediaries who route transactions or fence stolen data were typically weak spots in large-scale cybercrimes that enabled law enforcement intervention. Recall that several of Bogachev's money mules were identified by the police and interviewed during the course of the investigation, and that Gonzalez's entire scheme was brought down by the initial arrest and questioning of Maxim Yastremsky, who fenced the stolen payment card information online, and Jonathan Williams, a cashier carrying $200,000 in cash to Gonzalez and his associates. Law enforcement had new opportunities to track and catch the people involved at each monetization stage of the TJX breach: the sale of stolen data, the transfer of the profits back to the U.S. But while there was no getting around those attack stages for Gonzalez, Bogachev figured out a way to get rich without them. From a criminal's perspective, the most difficult or riskiest stages of cybercrimes have typically been the ones that come after the perpetrator has already successfully stolen data from a protected computer. Finding a way into a computer system to steal data is comparatively easy. Finding a way to monetize that data, making sure that credit card companies don't cancel all the cards whose numbers you've stolen before you have a chance to sell them, or identifying buyers willing to pay a good price, or hiding those profits from the police, can be much harder. Financial intermediaries are easy targets for law enforcement because their records often show a clear money trail between the victims and the perpetrators. The system of money mules utilized by Bogachev was slightly less risky than the cashers employed by Gonzalez because it did not require transporting any cash back into the United States, nor did it rely on the sale of stolen information through a centralized and well-known black market dealer like Yastremski, who was likely to attract the attention of the police. Indeed, that was part of the point of recruiting unemployed new mothers looking to earn money at home and the recently retired to process the transactions. They were unlikely to have the kind of targets on their backs that Yastremski did, and they would attract much less attention simply forwarding small transfers than they would by trying to find customers and sell stolen data or deliver large quantities of cash to Florida. But all the same, employing people like Michelli and Nelson, who were not hardened criminals, and indeed professed to be unaware they were involved in any criminal activity, created risks for Bogachev and his organization. Michelli and Nelson likely didn't know much about whom they were working for or what they were doing, but what they did know they were more than willing to pass on to the FBI when questioned. Meanwhile, CryptoLocker's ransomware scheme allowed Bogachev to eliminate most financial intermediaries and collect money directly from his victims by means of anonymous Bitcoin payments and prepaid cash vouchers. The ransomware model was advantageous for criminals not just because it eliminated the need for hiring and paying money mules, as well as the risk that they might be traced back to the criminals, but also because it generated profits from data that would otherwise have been worthless if sold on the black market. Up until ransomware, financially motivated cybercriminals had to find and steal only certain types of valuable data that other people would pay for. For example, credit card numbers, health records, social security numbers, intellectual property, or that could be used to initiate financial transfers directly, for example, account numbers, banking credentials. This meant that the vast majority of data was of no use to them. Most people's photos, files, and emails are of no value whatsoever on the black market, which may be one reason most people don't bother to protect these types of data. But these same files that would be worthless to other criminals are often of immense value to the people they belong to. CryptoLocker exploited that by selling data specifically back to the only person in the world for whom it had any value. Bogachev's organization developed this model at a moment when there was more and more stolen data available on the black market because of frequent large-scale data breaches. The value of that stolen data, even to criminals, was rapidly decreasing thanks to the overwhelming supply. From 2011 to 2016, the price of a stolen payment card record dropped from $25 to $6. So, not only were financially motivated criminals limited in what types of data they could monetize, but they were making smaller and smaller profits from selling their stolen data. Ransomware solved both those problems, enabling criminals like Bogachev to extract value from all sorts of seemingly worthless data stored on people's devices for much higher fees than they had ever been able to charge on the black market. CryptoLocker was not the first strain of ransomware, and Bogachev was not the first criminal to employ this economic model, but he was one of the first to employ it at large scale with such lucrative results. Ransomware programs date back as early as 1999, but they did not emerge as a popular mode of attack until more than a decade later, when Bitcoin and other anonymous modes of online payment became more mainstream, allowing criminals to shield their profits from being traced or blocked by law enforcement and financial intermediaries. Even today, cryptocurrencies are not routinely used by many of the people targeted by ransomware, who often struggle to figure out how, technically, they can make the demanded ransom payments. The gauze operators faced many victims who were willing to pay to regain access to their devices, but could not figure out how within the short time window given by CryptoLocker. Around November 2013, they set up a customer service site for CryptoLocker victims to walk them through the process of making the payments and help with the decryption process afterwards. This additional infrastructure detracted from the intermediary-free ideal of ransomware's model, however, as did the extensive record-keeping that the gauze organization did on the VisitCoastWeekend.com server, where the FBI found records of specific payments and victims. Law enforcement investigations were not the only threat, perhaps not even the primary threat, to the continued profitability of CryptoLocker and other successful ransomware operations. Ransomware distributors rely on people actually paying the demanded ransoms, and victims are less likely to pay if they suspect they won't actually receive a decryption key for their devices after doing so. After all, they have only the criminal's word that their devices and data really will be restored if they do pay the ransom. For that reason, it's in criminals' best interests to be honest, at least in honoring their promise to decrypt victims' devices after a ransom is received. But as online extortion became an increasingly viable and popular form of online crime in 2014 and 2015, more people began to develop and distribute ransomware programs, and not all of them were the trustworthy kind of criminals who bothered to actually reverse the encryption on victims' devices. That was bad news, of course, for the victims who paid up, only to find that they were still stuck without their data. But it was also bad news for the other criminals, the ones like Bogachev, who mostly did follow through on decrypting victims' data when paid. As word spread that paying ransoms did not always yield the desired results, users' already shaky trust in the criminals behind ransomware schemes weakened further. Victims became less likely to pay up, since they had no way of knowing whether they were dealing with a trustworthy criminal, that is, someone who would actually decrypt their hard drives when they paid the ransom, or an untrustworthy crook who would simply take the money and disappear without bothering to provide a decryption key. Despite this destabilization of the ransomware markets by an influx of untrustworthy criminals, ransomware operations continued to thrive even in the wake of the gauze and CryptoLocker takedown. In 2014, just as Operation Tovar was being completed, a new strain of ransomware dubbed CryptoWall appeared and went on to claim roughly $18 million in ransoms, according to FBI estimates. By comparison, CryptoLocker, over the course of its operation, was believed to have netted at least $3 million. In the fall of 2014, a pair of CryptoLocker copycats, dubbed CryptoLocker 2.0 and CryptoLocker.F, were detected on computers in Australia and soon spread to the rest of the world. These new classes of ransomware were sufficiently different from CryptoLocker in their delivery mechanisms and encryption schemes that many analysts believed CryptoLocker 2.0 and CryptoLocker.F were designed by different people from the ones who launched the original CryptoLocker. But whether or not Bogachev and his collaborators actually wrote these new pieces of malware, their influence and legacy in shaping the format and economic model of online crime were clear in the new strains named in tribute to their program. In 2015, the year after the takedown, the FBI reported 2,453 ransomware incidents, with losses totaling over $1.6 million. But it's likely this is a very incomplete tally, since individuals and organizations are under no obligation to report ransomware incidents to law enforcement. Estimates of ransom payments do not always accurately represent the losses incurred by ransomware, and not just because so many of these payments go unreported. As ransomware continued to evolve, it was adopted by new types of attackers and used for purposes beyond mere financial gain. In May 2017, a massive ransomware attack, dubbed WannaCry, shut down some 200,000 computer systems in hospitals, banks, governments, and companies worldwide, from Russia's Interior Ministry to the United Kingdom's National Health Service to police departments in India. The locked computers displayed messages demanding ransom payments, but by some estimates, the attackers made no more than around $50,000 from those demands, since many of the affected organizations chose to look for technical fixes rather than pay for each individual infected device. However, the damage the attack caused, both to the affected organizations as well as to their customers, patients, and citizens, was still substantial. Months later, evidence emerged that WannaCry had originated from North Korea, and the United States itself publicly accused the North Korean government of launching the attack. This attribution to a national government rather than a criminal operation cast uncertainty on whether WannaCry had ever been intended primarily as a means for financial profit. North Korea's involvement suggested the attack might instead have been meant more as an attempt to wreak havoc on the country's many enemies, with any financial gains serving merely as an added bonus. Ransomware appeared to have transcended its roots as a tool for financially motivated crime and developed into a more general attack model that cost its victims no less, even as it brought in smaller sums for its perpetrators. Learning from Zeus. Gauze and CryptoLocker taught criminals two very important lessons about how to make money from cybercrime. Use lots of confounding proxies and infrastructural intermediaries to throw law enforcement off your trail when infiltrating computers, but extort money by relying on as few financial intermediaries as possible so that law enforcement has minimal opportunities to interrupt the monetization process. For Gonzalez and his conspirators, the infiltration of the TJX servers was relatively quick and easy, but the monetization of that stolen data was slow and convoluted, requiring a number of middlemen and cashers, and correspondingly more people for the police to track. Bogachev flipped that process, building up the elaborate gauze infrastructure to compromise and communicate with machines in a convoluted manner that routed command and control instructions through a network of infected machines, but then keeping the financial transactions as fast and straightforward as possible. Extracting profits directly from victims and their bank accounts not only eliminated criminal financial intermediaries like Yastremski, who sold data on the black market, it also eliminated many legitimate intermediaries, especially the payment card networks. Part of what makes ransomware so effective and so difficult to combat is that individual users and organizations bear the costs directly. The victims of Gauze and CryptoLocker could not turn to their credit card companies or banks to reimburse them for fraudulent charges, and they could not file class action lawsuits against the retailers who had allowed their data to be stolen. The only financial intermediaries regulators and law enforcement could turn to in this space were the cryptocurrency exchanges, which converted bitcoins and other virtual currencies into non-virtual currencies, such as dollars or rubles. These exchanges provided a rare opportunity for defenders to interrupt the monetization of ransomware incidents, assuming that the criminals would eventually, want to convert their cryptocurrency profits into local currency. A reasonable assumption, especially during the CryptoLocker infections, since bitcoins were certainly not universally accepted. But cryptocurrency exchanges existed all over the world, and U.S. regulations requiring them to obtain identification from customers and keep detailed records had little impact on the foreign exchanges where Bogachev and his conspirators could cash in their profits. In the absence of centralized financial intermediaries who could be held responsible or forced to bear the costs of ransomware thefts, the financial burden for these incidents fell completely on the individuals and organizations who were targeted. There was a certain justice in that. Those victims were the ones who had let their devices become infected and failed to keep adequate backups of their data, and in the case of CryptoLocker, made the decision to pay for a decryption key. But in other ways, this absence of a powerful intermediary class was detrimental to everyone, because it meant there were no well-resourced, centralized companies or institutions besides the FBI, with any incentive to try to drive down the costs or to invest in better technologies to strengthen security. Ransomware forces individual victims not only to shoulder the costs of a security breach entirely on their own, but also to face the knowledge that if they do give in to a ransom demand, they are directly contributing to criminals' profits and thereby encouraging more criminals to undertake similar operations. Choosing whether or not to acquiesce to extortion by ransomware is not just a decision about how much victims trust their adversary to decrypt their data, or how much their data is worth to them. It's also a decision about the extent to which they are comfortable perpetuating ransomware as a profitable enterprise for criminals. In the years following Operation Tovar, law enforcement organizations struggled to come to grips with the continued growth of ransomware and how much power lay in the hands of individual victims compared to how little control law enforcement officers had over emerging CryptoLocker-like online extortion schemes. This realization led to sometimes perplexing and often conflicting advice for victims, as law enforcement organizations wrestled with the limits of their own power. To be honest, we often advise people just to pay the ransom, FBI agent Joseph Bonavolonta said in a talk in October 2015, stirring controversy with his indirect recommendation to give in to criminals' demands and implicit admission that there was little the FBI could do to help victims in such cases. The FBI later backpedaled on Bonavolonta's remarks, insisting that their official guidance was for victims not to pay ransoms, but this guidance was undercut somewhat by numerous examples of police departments across the country acceding to ransomware demands. Faced with the conundrum of not wanting to encourage people to hand over their money to criminal operations, but also knowing that that was likely their best shot at recovering their lost data, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies appear to be conflicted about what they should tell victims to do and what they should do themselves. At the heart of this challenge is a deeper question over what the role of law enforcement entities and policymakers should be in a criminal environment based on decentralized infrastructure and extortion. The traditional roles for policymakers and law enforcement officers in this domain, targeting financial intermediaries with regulations and thorough criminal investigations, are far less effective when dealing with cryptocurrencies, which cannot be as easily controlled or monitored as they enter and leave the country. Accordingly, the FBI and its collaborators in Operation Tovar instead targeted the infrastructural intermediaries that composed the gauze bot, going after the bot's technical architecture, the DGA, the potential command and control domains, even the individual compromised computers that had been infected by gauze. This was moderately effective in taking down Bogachev's operation, at least temporarily, but it is unclear how scalable or sustainable such an approach could be for dealing with ransomware or distributed bots in general. Law enforcement cannot target infrastructure intermediaries the same way they do financial intermediaries, because the so-called infrastructural intermediaries are mostly just everyday computer users and their devices, rather than powerful banks or payment networks with lots of resources to devote to fraud prevention. Internet service providers, many of whom were involved in Operation Tovar, have the potential to be a more centralized and useful set of intermediaries than individual users for controlling and restricting bot traffic. ISPs have considerable insight into network traffic patterns and can therefore identify bots and block malicious traffic fairly effectively. But they do not stand to lose money or be held liable for the spread of malware like gauze or CryptoLocker, so they have little incentive to take action against these threats. In fact, ISPs may fear losing customers and money if they do block malicious traffic or cut off Internet access to infected machines, because their customers who own and operate those devices may be frustrated with the service interruption, regardless of whether it's done to force them to remove malware from their computers. Those customers, of course, are the people who truly stand to lose from ransomware. The costs of such incidents falls squarely on their shoulders. Yet, individually, there is a limited amount they can do to stem its spread beyond practicing basic computer hygiene and creating regular backups of their data. Moreover, they are unlikely to have much incentive to do even that until their devices are infected and they find themselves personally paying the price for operating unprotected computers. That is what makes ransomware such a difficult type of crime to protect against. Large, powerful, centralized intermediaries bear very little liability for it, and therefore have almost no reason to try to stop it, while individual, decentralized end users shoulder all the costs, but have little power to fight it. The sole power those users have, besides backing up their files and not clicking on suspicious email links or attachments or online ads, is to refuse to pay the demanded ransoms. That suggests one way in which law enforcement and policymakers could potentially make a difference in this fight, by more clearly and urgently advising users not to give in to these demands, or by taking stringent measures to make it more difficult to purchase bitcoins, more financially onerous to make ransom payments, or even outright illegal to pay ransoms. Yet government officials, faced with a threat that is largely impervious to traditional policing tactics, seem to have drawn the opposite lesson, advising victims to pay ransoms, or otherwise implying that they may have no other choice. But Bogachev's wildly lucrative criminal enterprise and the ensuing wave of similar crimes suggests a set of very different lessons. It highlights the importance of policymakers concentrating financial liability for these security incidents on a strong, centralized set of intermediaries, like ISPs, who are well poised to defend against them, so as to give them an incentive to do so. Beyond that, the role of policymakers is in pressuring people by all means possible not to pay these ransoms, and thereby to drive the criminals out of business. While the costs are so widely distributed, it is hard to imagine anyone outside of government stakeholders having a strong incentive to tackle ransomware at their own expense. The evolution of financially motivated cybercrimes, from payment card fraud to identity theft to ransomware, has been guided in large part by criminals' preferences for business models that do not pit them against powerful centralized intermediaries who can unilaterally monitor or cut off their profits. Payment card fraud of the sort perpetrated by Gonzalez and his co-conspirators took advantage of the complicated web of intermediaries involved in the payment card industry and their ongoing disputes about how best to protect against fraud and who should bear the costs of it. But despite those disputes, the banks, retailers, and payment networks who serve as the primary lines of defense for incidents such as the TJX breach are often well-resourced and able to cut down on some, if not all, of criminals' profits. Furthermore, payment card fraud often creates opportunities for law enforcement to monitor sales of stolen credit card numbers and trace the delivery of those profits back to the perpetrators, as they did with Yastremsky, Gonzalez, and Bogachev. These powerful centralized defenders, and the necessity of going through them for the essential monetization stages of payment card fraud incidents, made these schemes vulnerable to both interruption and prosecution. Identity fraud schemes of the sort that could be perpetrated using the SCDOR stolen data mitigated but did not entirely overcome these hurdles from the criminal's perspective. Filing fraudulent IRS returns, for instance, eliminated the need for thieves to use stolen data quickly before it expired, and also removed the incentives of payment networks and retailers to intervene. But at the same time, this model also introduced new potential defenders, such as the IRS or medical insurers, and perhaps more importantly, it still relied on the sale of stolen data through centralized online black market forums that could be monitored and shut down. Ransomware schemes like CryptoLocker took criminals even further from the original payment card fraud model by removing the need to exfiltrate data from targeted computers, much less sell it through any online forum. In doing so, perpetrators of ransomware eliminated several key bottleneck stages that defenders might try to interrupt. By storing the encrypted data directly on victims' own computers and selling it directly back to them for virtual currency, criminals like Bogachev were largely able to escape facing powerful third parties with strong incentives to intervene, as well as avoid the sorts of stolen data marketplaces most susceptible to law enforcement observation. Even so, the FBI ultimately identified Bogachev in part through the very same mechanism that led to Gonzalez's downfall, his money mules. Those intermediaries were not essential for spreading or profiting from ransomware, but Bogachev had used gauze to undertake some other older forms of financial cybercrime prior to unleashing CryptoLocker, and it was those earlier models that led the FBI to him. Actually, it led the FBI only as close to him as they could get, which, as it turned out, was not very close at all, so long as Bogachev was happy to remain on the Black Sea and Russia was happy to have him. Without Russia's cooperation, the United States could make some progress toward curtailing Bogachev's profits, hunting down his money mules, disrupting his bot, seizing his servers, but could do very little to stop the man himself.